Friends, you are most welcome to Civil Affairs channel. Today we are going to discuss Social Anthropology by Maan IGNOU, mane004 Gender and Society, and our topic is Globalization and Gender. Let us begin the topic. Introduction part: Globalization process and their impacts, globalization and gender equality, feminization of poverty and female headed households, women work and globalization, gender inclusive globalization. Summary part. Learning objectives are: after going through this unit, you will be able to understand the process of globalization and their differentiated impacts on marginalized populations and women, how globalization contributes to enhanced gender inequality, and how the negative effects of globalization can be minimized by mainstreaming gender in our social and economic policies. Introduction part: Globalization processes and their impacts. Within cross cultural perspectives, it is important to discuss the issue of globalization and gender. The phenomena of globalization, which has impacted our society in numerous ways, has particularly affected the everyday lives of women, especially from developing countries. In this unit, we will study the implication of globalization on gender with a special focus on women's work and poverty among women. Let us begin by first understanding what we mean by globalization. Globalization refers to a number of events that have been rapidly changing the world, especially since the 1980s. It is primarily driven by the global economy, mainly the policies of privatization, selling government owned assets and business to private multinational companies, and deregulating, lifting trade restrictions, easing of government regulations, allowing foreign businesses to operate within our country, and floating of national currencies in the global marketplace. Prior to the 1980s, in the most of the countries, governments were handling all the businesses and government owned all the assets in the country. The ultimate goal of globalization processes is to have a privatized economy which allows a healthy competition for goods and services within the free market across national borders. It is believed that this enables people to have access to better services and products at lower prices, eventually leading to a better standards of living or human well-being. Along with the diffusion of goods, services and capital, globalization also involves diffusion of technology, information, culture and people across national borders. Kagate and Irturk 2004. And all this has led to fundamental changes in human institutions in practically all societies across the globe. Since the mid 1980s, many scholars in the social sciences have studied the causes, scope, and impact of globalization. Mayer 2006. Along with economic integration of different countries, globalization has also brought industrialization to the developing countries, which has led to economic growth in these regions. Since the 1980s, many Asian countries have emerged as significant manufacturers of the products such as textiles, steel, cars, electronics, computer equipments, etc. This has led to the creation of jobs for millions of people in these countries. As a result, one important trend worldwide has been that there has been an increase in the contribution of the secondary sector, manufactured products or material goods, and tertiary sector essential services to the gross domestic product GDP of the most countries. This means that there has been an increase in jobs in the secondary and tertiary sectors. Growth in tertiary sectors, however, has been greater than the secondary sector, and the relative contribution of the primary sector, agriculture, mining, forestry, and fishing, to the GDP has been declining steadily. This trend in the global economy is closely related to skill differentiation. The unskilled and semi skilled jobs, mainly in the primary and secondary sector, are primarily taken up by the less privileged section of the society, whereas skilled jobs of the service sector are occupied by the upper income groups of the society. Wage differences between the skilled and unskilled jobs have also grown sharply, creating heightened disparities between these groups. On a broader level, disparities between rural and urban areas developed and developing countries have also increased. Effects of globalization have also differed across groups of class, race, ethnicity, and gender. Many researchers have said that globalization is a double blended phenomenon. Kateri, Kate and Irturk 2004 with unequal distribution of benefits and harms. Many researchers have said that globalization is a double blended phenomenon with unequal distribution of benefits and harms. Trade liberalization is not inherently welfare producing. It can produce and reproduce inequality, social disparities, and poverty at the same time as it expands wealth, say in 1996. Today, the global system is marked with widening income disparities, economic growth disparities, human capital disparities such as life expectancy, nutrition, infant and child mortality, adult literacy, and enrollment ratio. Along with this are disparities in the distribution of global economic resources and opportunities, and globalization adds to this. In such a scenario, it is the interest of the poor and underprivileged that are most affected, and amongst them of the women, such as finance, insurance, real estate, wholesale, retail, motor trade, catering, and accommodation, transport, and communication. The dominance of rich nations, multinational corporations, and international capital over markets, resources, and labor in the developing countries through trade, aid, and technology transfer has greatly weakened the capacity of nation states and government to promote human development and offer protection to the poor people. Since the resources for the social sector come out of an ever shrinking common pool, the burden on women is much more. The worst hit in the transformation is the unorganized or informal sector, marked with income disparity and dominated by the poor and underprivileged. Pandey 2001. Apart from changes associated with global trade, the other facets of globalization are increased migration, spread of global culture, development of internet and easier communication and transportation around the world, accelerated development and transfer of technologies in all spheres, including reproductive technologies, tourism, etc. All these have both positive and negative dimensions and also differentiated impacts on men and women. However, detailed discussion on these is beyond the scope of this unit. We shall concentrate here on impact of trade liberalization on gender equality. Globalization and gender equality. While we stated in the beginning that the major transformation in global economy occurred around 1980s, we need to understand that the process of globalization are closely associated with the colonialism and capitalism which have transformed traditional economies over the last couple of centuries. All, all scholars agree that colonialism and capitalism restructured traditional economies in a way which had a profound impact on women's economic activities, on the nature of sexual division of labor, and on the kinds of social and political options which remained open to women. However, there is considerable debate about the exact nature of the effects of these processes on women's lives. Scholars like Bosserup 1970 and Rogers 1980 have suggested that capitalist exploitation combined with Eurocentric ideas about the roles and activities proper to women led to the destruction of women's traditional right in society and undermined their economic autonomy. Other writers have pointed out that it may be wrong to imagine that the pre colonial or pre capitalist world was one where women had a significant degree of independence. However, the penetration of capitalism into subsistence economies through the growth of commercial agriculture and wage labor is acknowledged as having generally deleterious effect on rural women. A number of authors have stressed that the development of intensive agriculture and the introduction of new forms of technology discriminated against women, an increasing market in land and labor, together with changes in land tenure system and developing migrant labor, also worked against the interest of women. Murray 1988. The transformation of global economy around the 1980s has accentuated the disadvantaged position of women in the developing countries. Feminist researchers and activists have repeatedly pointed to a variety of gender biases of structural adjustment policies. Structural Adjustment Policies (SAPs) are economic policies for developing countries that have been promoted by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund (IMF) since the early 1980s by the provision of loans conditional on the adoption of such policies. SAPs are designed to encourage the structural adjustment of an economy to promote privatization and deregulation. In the case of Morocco, Scali 2001 mentions that the social effects and cost of structural adjustment programs (SAPs) have proved to be specifically detrimental to women in low income households and made their status even more vulnerable. The situation is quite similar to in other developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The differentiated impacts of globalization processes on men and women are because of a number of reasons. Firstly, a discrepancy exists in almost all economies between women and men's access to resources, knowledge, ownership, and control over assets. Patriarchal societies like the Indian society, where men have authority and control over property, men traditionally hold a privileged position as compared to women, who are seen as subordinate. Patriarchy also manifests itself in the social, legal, political, and economic organizations, and it is seen that globalization has heightened already existing biases in patriarchal societies. Discussing the case of Morocco, Scali 2001 states that the patriarchal structure of the society operates at all levels to position women in lower status than men. Patriarchal ideology and systematic gender biases have denied women not only equal educational and employment opportunities and treatment before the law, but also equal access to and control over resources, adequate health services, housing, social welfare, and support. These are important social indicators that have a direct bearing on the incidence of female poverty and reflect the different levels at which social exclusion is produced, justified, and perpetuated. Discrepancy also exists between men and women in terms of patterns of paid and unpaid works, wages, ability to generate income, educational patterns, and political and economic power. Kate and Arturk 2004. Women's low educational opportunities and skill training have a direct bearing on female work pattern. Women get caught in the cycle of exploitation and underpayment as they increasingly occupy the lower paying unskilled jobs. There exists salary gap between working men and women, and many women continue to work below the minimum wage. In rural areas, female labor around the world continues to go unrecognized and unpaid, as it falls under the category of farm work or income generating activities within home in areas such as arts and crafts, weaving, and cottage industries. Mais 1982 describes in her study of lace makers of Andhra Pradesh, India, that growing impoverishment of the peasant agricultural sector has led women in poorer agricultural households to take up lace making for private exporters as a way of generating supplementary income. These women are invisible as workers because of the prevailing and overriding ideology that they are rely on housewives who happen to be using their leisure time in a profitable way. Thus, women generate supplementary income for the household without altering the sexual division of labor or the nature of gender relation in the society. Consequently, women's insertion into the global market production system has merely served to reinforce existing gender relations. More in 1988. Let us now take a closer look at how globalization is said to have contributed to growing poverty among women.